Welcome to the Relationships Inside Out podcast with Doctors Gregory Siebert and Kimberly Murray, licensed marriage and family therapists. Join them on this journey as they explore the ins and outs of relationships.
Well, welcome to Relationships Inside Out, where we have an episode today on rigid boundaries.
We mentioned in our last episode enmeshment, right? These diffuse boundaries that are very permeable. They're not even boundaries, to be honest. It is a kind of a free-for-all in terms of emotion, and my lived experience is based on yours. This is the opposite. I talk about like the FU boundaries. I live by a very strict code of self or preferences or values, and they are not flexible. They do not move for anyone. They do not care for anyone, but I expect you to follow them.
So, yeah, we talked last episode, and that's really Horace, a lot more of your life is my life.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're in this together. There's really no privacy, right?
Think like a Swiss cheese wall here, lots of holes.
Everybody's in your business.
Mm-hmm.
Rigid is where you don't know anybody's business.
It's titanium wall. We're not getting through that.
And some might be like, well, yeah, I don't want people to know my business. And when we're trying to develop healthy relationships where we can be vulnerable, and experience, some of those deep emotions like that, we have to be just that vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't be vulnerable when we're rigid and we have all these boundaries that other people need to engage in for me to even be a part of their life.
And that's kind of the hallmark, right, of what you're saying is it's not just about, I don't want to share my business. And you're going to follow my way or the highway, right? You're going to follow this or I'm going to cut you out.
Mm-hmm.
Or I'm going to be volatile, talk down to you, judge you, whatever it might be. But there will be mass consequences for you not following my boundaries. I am no longer considerate of you and your space. It is solely about me and mine.
And boundaries are often learned.
Mm-hmm.
So it could have been generational where this just in their family, we didn't talk about emotions or we didn't talk about sex, or, you couldn't be in other people's business or ask questions about, I don't know, whatever, like hobbies, for example, I don't know. Or religion. So yeah, lost my train of thought there.
That's okay. But I think it goes beyond that. I think it goes beyond, we just don't talk about these things, to cold, to stark, to really putting, like you see my hands, if you're watching the YouTube, to really putting up a big front and wall.
Yeah, it's very cold and you feel isolated. You don't feel like anyone can take care of you. Mm-hmm. Or anyone's there for you. And often you see, I was saying that, there you go, came back. The boundaries are learned, or it could be when you think about rigid boundaries, it's often there to protect us, right? It's like, it could be in response to trauma. Like maybe your family had really healthy boundaries growing up, and in a romantic relationship later in life, it was very abusive, either emotional or sexual or all of the above. And so you in that you've learned to be rigid because that's too scary to be vulnerable because of what happened. So it can come from a couple of places. However, it has consequences long term. When you think about, let's look at romantic relationships. So if you come from a household with very rigid boundaries and you never learn to talk about emotions or even fight, maybe parents even hid fighting from everybody. That's a rigid boundary. Nobody sees us fight. Well, they don't know how to fight, and anytime it comes up, it's seen as problematic. It's like the end of the world.
Sure.
So there's a lot of issues that can arise depending on what boundaries we're talking about, and especially if they're very rigid.
In relationships, there has to be this give and take, and this is the opposite of that. There is no give and take. It's not reciprocal. It is, again, rigid. And to your point of the vulnerability, we often think of someone who's rigid or has rigid boundaries, it's like a hard ass, or they're mean or strict. And we pair these words with it. But when I think of someone who's really rigid, I actually think of someone who's particularly vulnerable.
Porcupine.
Yes. Who is kind of soft and squishy on the inside, despite their outward appearance, but really prickly, those quills on the outside.
Or pineapple.
You have lots of examples for this, Greg. I'm mad impressed. But it's actually quite a vulnerable thing, just like narcissism. We think of that as someone who's just really mean and all the things, but we don't think about what's actually underneath that BS. And it typically is some of the greatest vulnerability. It is fear of getting hurt. It is fear of rejection. It is past trauma. It is this way of protecting myself so that no one can ever do that again. So I don't ever have a moment of losing control again. That's often a big one, right? I get rigid so I don't lose control. I get rigid so no one can hurt me, whatever it might be. But I want to add that in here of, as we talk about people who are rigid, I don't want you just having this image of someone who's mean or cruel. I really do want to speak to it. Often comes from a place of pain and fear.
Yeah. And again, the intention is to protect oftentimes. And because
protect self, typically not other.
Yes. Protecting yourself. So in a relationship, whether that's friendship or romantic relationship, they often feel disconnected. You don't learn much about them. They don't talk about themselves. They don't really let anyone in. And with that, you can't have that connection, those deep connections that are really rooted in being able to be vulnerable with one another. So yes, it does protect us, and it also keeps us isolated.
And as mentioned in the enmeshment one, rigidity is more acceptable in some cultures than others, just like enmeshment, right? In collectivistic cultures, it might be more acceptable to be more enmeshed, less acceptable to be rigid. In individualistic cultures, it's likely the reverse. We were talking about, before this episode, talking about the research behind both of these constructs, and there's a lot more on enmeshment. And I think it's because in our culture, in US culture, individuation is seen as a good thing. It is prioritized. And so the idea of someone being strict or rigid, I mean, not always great, but it's less jarring than someone who is enmeshed or quote unquote a mama's boy or whatever it might be. Whereas in other cultures, it's going to be the reverse. So our research is heavily focused on what we see as more jarring, which would be the enmeshment. But what we know is both can be detrimental to individual success and relationship health and sense of self and confidence.
Yeah. And in terms of the relationship self, I think all this comes up with like many cases I've had over the decades. And it's so hard because you often see the ones with rigid boundaries don't want to ask for help.
Truth.
And
it's too vulnerable.
How do you have a partnership or a friendship when you can't?
Even parent-child, right? Yes, we expect parents to be a leader, but if there's never a softness to them, how as a child am I going to approach you? How am I going to tell you when I'm scared, when I'm struggling, when I screwed up? How am I going to be vulnerable and learn what it is to be vulnerable if the person I'm trying to do that with is cold and pushed away? Can't.
And for some, it's just normal. And you will see this generational, just like the enmeshment, you will see this.
Absolutely.
Even clients, even friends I'll see, and then I'll meet their parent. I'm like,
oh, full circle.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And they're like, I hate this parent. And you're like, you're just like them.
Because parents who are rigid develop rigid kids. And the paradox of that is now you have a rigid parent and a rigid child. We want to talk about volatility because I'm worried about me right now.
Yeah, because your rules that people need to engage in might be different than the parent.
And neither one of us are being flexible.
Yeah.
That can create what we see as cutoffs, where I push people away entirely, where I no longer talk to people because it's intolerable that they will not honor the boundaries in which I have set.
And it's sad because at the same time of wanting to protect self, often in human nature, we want closeness. We want that connection. And you'll hear, well, why would I want to do that? Like, I'm just going to get hurt again. Well, with that belief, why would you want to make yourself vulnerable again? And granted, you don't have to let your guard down right away. This is a gradual process. But we're talking about in cases where you never let that go. Rarely ever. It's just kind of the way. And this is where you don't see the connections in relationships. You see issues with reciprocity because they don't ask for help. They take on the things and then they're burnt out. It's like, why don't you ask the partner for need? Oh, I don't ask for help. Oh, why not? Well, I never had anyone help me growing up. I had clients where this one partner never had any help from anybody. It's quite sad. And their partner, they found out their partner put them on all their life insurance policies and investments and retirement, and they broke down.
I believe it.
They broke down.
It's a profound moment.
Wow, what do you even do? It's very uncomfortable because it's depending on how far back that goes in terms of the rigid boundaries with the family or themselves. It may not have ever experienced.
And it can be shattering to narrative in a good way, right? It can illuminate that some people maybe can do that for you. I think underlying this is trust. Can I trust you that you won't hurt me enough that I can soften my wall? Can I trust that if I soften this boundary, you're still going to have my best interest at heart? If the answer is no, right, there's no trust, and those boundaries are going to remain really rigid and tight.
So I'm going to ask you, can you fathom a relationship that's healthy where emotions can't be talked about?
No. Even for me, like even the parent child, am I going to go to my daughter and say like, your dad and I are fighting and I'm upset about it? No,
Why not?
that's enmeshment, folks. But is she never going to see me cry or hurt? No to that either, because I want her to see me be human. I want her to see me struggle so that she knows it's okay to struggle. So no, I can't imagine that. Even some might argue the workplace, but even there, I think it's okay to be human. I think that's at the core of us as therapists. Core of me as a person is I like the human authentic selves.
Yeah.
So could I be in a relationship with someone like that? No. No, I need emotions to connect.
It doesn't make sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk about this case that really stands out to me. I was working with a family, and they've been to many family therapists before.
Mm-hmm.
So they got assigned to me, and sitting with them, you can tell there's some rigidity. And I can tell, and there was 3, I can tell that the mom and daughter didn't feel safe. Not in a physical sense, but just they couldn't be safe to be vulnerable. And anytime, and as therapists, we want to get at emotions.
Mm-hmm.
It was like getting stonewalled. I'm like, this is interesting. So then I pry on the dad, and because I was trying to find who holds the emotional boundaries, who's holding this rigid boundary,
Who set the precedent.
Yeah, exactly. And so it was the father, and so I dig into a little bit his past, and his family was rigid, things like this. And it got to a point where, and I don't remember exactly, what happened in the dialogue. He broke down crying, and then all of a sudden you see the mom and daughter just jump over to him and hug him, and they're like,
softening.
This is the language. This is exactly what we've wanted all this time.
Mm-hmm.
And they've said this is the first time we've ever seen him cry.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting because they came in for, of course, the typical, the daughter with identified patient. But after that, I mean, they said they had a breakthrough. Her symptoms dissipated.
Because they're not being held on these eggshells or this rigidity. You get to be more authentic and actually connect.
Yeah, and they were stuck. There was fear that they weren't even going to go anywhere after school, and then went to college, healthy relationship.
What was that like for you? That's a profound moment.
I mean, I think that's where I learned how important the boundaries were, and being a barrier to people living like a healthy life. Like there has to be some recipe where boundaries make sense to certain families. It doesn't mean the same boundary level and strictness makes sense to every family, but in this particular case, that emotions and being able to express that were so important for 2 of the members, that when they were able to, so much, and then interestingly enough, the father was able to be vulnerable because he was met with love and compassion.
So say he created safety and thus trust, because I fell apart and I was held, not judged.
Yeah, and the boundary was always that emotions are scary and they're weak. You're weak if you express them, and that was kind of the narrative that held that rigid boundary. And you can also see why it was eliciting the symptoms in the daughter, anxiety, depression, and other stuff. I won't go into detail, but yeah, it was very fascinating, and it felt really good to be able to be a part of that process. Because, from some divine intervention, you asked the right question for some reason.
Sure.
And it just.
And what's interesting about that, obviously, I don't know how the family is now or anything about the case.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that moment probably had a profound ripple effect for generations to come. Because now she might choose a partner who's a little bit softer because she's experienced that.
Yeah.
She might feel more confident in herself and thus attract different people into her world. It has this ripple effect that once there's a little bit of softening, I'm not saying enmeshment, but a little bit of softening, it can ripple out to all members of the family. It can ripple out to the next round of kids and marriages. It's really interesting.
It's fascinating. I mean, I think about it a lot when I think about boundaries, and when I'm looking at couples now, I'm always looking at what is the boundary level, rigid versus meshed around emotions, and that tends to play a role in most of the cases I see. So yeah, I love that as a way to explain the rigidity of it. Is here's one person who's, I guess, normal. That's what they grew up in. there's nothing wrong with that. Why would there be anything wrong with emotions? And I actually had to have a conversation about what is healthy emotions and what it looked like to really reshape and reauthor that, help them reauthor their narrative around what emotions mean.
And that question's a good one. What is healthy, rather than the prescription of this is what's healthy?
Yeah.
That's important as we're talking about anything with boundaries. What you view as healthy or good for your family might be different than someone else. There isn't a single prescription of this is what is healthy and this is the only way you can do it in every culture and every family system. It's really checking in with yourself, what feels good and healthy for me and what doesn't.
And I think similar to enmeshment, the function of a rigid approach is protection and safety and love. There isn't an intention of wanting people to feel left out or isolated. However, that's the byproduct when they're too rigid.
Absolutely. And rigidity can come from lots of sources. Some big ones that we see are like military or faith or a trauma-based system, or even families that are emotionally insecure, right? We have to be really tight about things. We have to run a strict ship, even in single parent homes. Sometimes it's out of survival. I've got to be rigid to keep our family functioning, to keep my sanity as a parent, whatever it might be. And sometimes it can be from past family. It can be from my job. Whatever the precipitating source of it, it is exploring and what function is it serving now, and is that functional and healthy?
And typically, one thing that I typically see along the list that you're saying is that they have poor distress tolerance. They don't want to feel uncomfortable.
Or can't tolerate one more piece of distress because the world is already so stressful.
So keeping boundaries around to make sure that nobody, overflows that cup of stress. So it's and because they don't know how to manage the emotions, because it's uncomfortable, and so they create rules about that. And I think a lot about the boundaries being around what we're uncomfortable with, and that's how a lot of people establish them, whether they're learned or not. But when they're learning them, they're learning that this boundary's here because it's not safe, or we don't want that to happen, or this isn't okay. And with that, it tends to be a theme of we're anxious around these things, or we're uncomfortable around these things.
Sure.
So boundaries are a way of control.
And control soothes anxiety. That's what I was saying earlier about the softness that's actually in someone who's really rigid. When we see rigidity, often it is to create predictability. Predictability is something that anxiety tells us we need all the time. And the more stressed or anxious we are, the more we crave control and predictability. So the tighter that boundary gets. So if someone's really rigid, I task you with thinking about what could be under all of that. What is their soft belly part? Right? I think about, we're animals at our core, right? What happens when I yell at a dog, or if someone hits a dog?
Oh,
they're going to cower.
Why does that have to be the example? That one kills me.
But it's real. They cower. They show their teeth. They get defensive. They get mean. We're people. People are animals. We do the same thing. When we get really hurt, we get really firm in those boundaries, and don't you dare cross them, or I'm going to bite you and make you regret it. At the core, we are the same.
Yeah.
We want to protect ourselves, and it comes from somewhere. Even in terms of faith, right? I'm protecting my salvation. There's no greater thing that I've got to protect. And so to do that, to protect my kids' salvation, I'm going to follow rigidity. I'm going to follow this rigid set of rules, no break from them, because it risks the greatest thing that could be taken away.
That makes me think of families where they were isolated. So this world is scary.
Yeah.
So they keep that. You were talking about military earlier, and I want to share personal experiences.
For those who don't know, Greg is a veteran too.
Yeah. And when I came back from war, I very much was so rigid because I needed predictability, because it was scary, right? We got mortared 8 to 10 times a day out there where I was at. And it was like, you don't know. You don't really know what the day brings. And so you come back into the rigid boundaries, and I pretty much lost almost all my friends. Oof. And I don't blame it. I feel bad. I look back and I'm like, oh my goodness. And at the same time, I'm giving myself compassion. Like you were in war.
Survival.
Like you came back. Yeah. And so those boundaries, although they were there to protect me, I had a consequence, which I felt alone and isolated. And this is a story I see and experience with a ton of veterans themselves, is isolated. And you break it down, and it's like, well, you're protecting yourself. And you should. Well, let's work on that. Let's see how we can let people in. So it's a big one. And glad that you brought that about in terms of predictability, because predictability is a big one when
your world feels
safety.
like chaos, feels out of control, feels threatening. First thing we're going to want to go for is predictability.
Overstimulation, no good. This is why, going to Costco is not a good thing for some of the veterans, some of us veterans. We're like, this is too much. There's no predictability. There's carts going every which way, and
Costco's like a jungle anyway.
Yeah, this is true.
But I appreciate you sharing that. And whether it's the military or other trauma or a chaotic home life, whatever it might be, you might find yourself leaning that direction. And it's not a judgment base. Again, just like with enmeshment, there's no judgment, but it's finding what is healthy. I think what's important to point out here too is perspective matters. So what I see as a normal, healthy boundary, someone else might view as rigid.
Oh, you're so rigid. I'm just kidding.
I know, I'm such a rigid human. But like example, say there's a family member who is an alcoholic. You might set the boundary of, I will be around you, but you can't drink in my home. Conceivably a healthy boundary, actually.
Sure.
But the alcoholic might see that as, you're rigid, you're trying to control me, you're telling me what to do with my life, and thus they want no part of you. Just because one person receives it as rigid doesn't mean it is or that it's bad. I want to be really clear about that. But it's worth taking in the feedback, right? If the greater sense is, no, that's actually an okay boundary, you're okay. It isn't about everyone's assessment of your boundaries as being diffuse, rigid, or somewhere in between. It's what feels healthy and functional for you. So if I made that boundary, that would feel healthy and functional for me, even if it doesn't for that other person.
And I think about an example you gave in several episodes ago when we were talking about the holidays and having the family discussion of, well, we're just going to have it for ourselves. We want to do that this year. We want to create something new for ourselves. It didn't have anything to do with anybody else. And the feedback typically was that you're being super rigid.
You're cutting us out. You're making us miss out.
Yeah. And you typically get that with setting boundaries, like we talked about in every episode. We talked about boundaries. So pretty much all of them is that people who benefited from the poor boundaries are going to be the ones that are upset the most.
Absolutely.
And there's some healthiness, but I love what you said is evaluate that, take the feedback. Like, is this too rigid? Like, are we being inflexible here? And
there might be times when you really are being too rigid.
Yeah.
So take the feedback, see where you can wiggle if you can.
And with the rigid, if you find yourself as someone who has rigid boundaries, go to therapy and talk with someone and explore what is the function of those for yourself. And I say therapy because that's safe, right? And somebody who has insight about these and can provide a different perspective. Find out what they are. What is the function of them? And maybe even heal some of the parts that you're protecting to get more vulnerable, because there's a whole world we're missing out on when we're that rigid. And it's uncomfortable. And even if the people around you aren't rigid and you're rigid, like for an example for me, people around me weren't rigid. I was so rigid. It causes chaos in their lives and it's very uncomfortable for them. And they'll lose them and disconnect. This is why those with very rigid boundaries don't have a lot of close relationships.
People feel like they're walking on eggshells or can't be their authentic selves or worry about stepping on your toes.
Explore that. Understand, why do I need these boundaries? Why are they here? And some of them you actually might need, depending on who it is, of like, oh, they're no longer allowed in my life based on how they treated, my family member or my kids or whatever.
It does vary by person, right? That's a great point. How rigid I am varies by the person. Go back to the alcoholic. Maybe you let other people drink in your home. But this particular one that might struggle with alcoholism, it's a different ballgame. Maybe my boundary with them is I won't go to a bar, but I'll go get coffee. Whereas I might go to bars with my friends. It's okay to have different boundaries depending on the person, the context, how you're feeling in that moment. And these are going to ebb and flow. There are going to be times, like you spoke to, when you got home from the war, you were more rigid maybe than you were before you left. And now maybe you're less again. And so there's this ebb and flow where there are going to be times when I'm more rigid, times when I'm less. It's okay to ride that wave, but just continually checking in with self of, how am I doing what feels good for me, for my system? How am I impacting others? And really evaluating from there.
And boundaries, and just to kind of cover this again, it's, behavioral boundaries, like how people act or how you expect people to act. It could be emotions, like we talked about in some of the examples. It could be sexual stuff, like how that's talked about, how that's expressed. Financial.
Am I contributing to my family's finances? Is it just my own? Do my partner and I have joint bank accounts? Do we talk about money with our kids?
Yeah. And it could be stuff that you don't even think about. I mean, those are the general categories. One that came up for me that I realized I had and I didn't know is, maybe I'm too rigid on this, but if I have somebody who can't apologize for their behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
I have a problem with that.
Yeah.
They'll apologize for their emotions. Don't apologize for how you feel.
Or I'm sorry I made you feel.
Yeah.
It's my favorite.
Oh, so yeah, and you never need to apologize for your emotions if you felt that way. It's how you responded to that stuff.
Sure.
And you might just, that doesn't mean, no one would really think of that when you think about boundaries.
But it's so important.
But it is. That has to do probably in the emotional realm of how our emotions managed and expressed, and or even behaviors apologize. So maybe it's a mixture.
Rigidity can show up in your gender roles, your household chores, your hobbies, your travel, your parenting. I mean, there's a million ways this shows up. And the question is, am I considerate of my partner, of my system, or just me?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it is going to be just about me. And that's, at least from our culture, that's okay. But if that's my constant state, I might be really lonely.
And a general barometer is in anything, any diagnosis or not diagnosis, any symptoms you're experiencing. The question is it impairing my ability to function? Same thing with here. Are my boundaries impairing my ability to function? And if you feel like they are in some context, then maybe it's time to explore and look into it.
I can't emphasize enough for the parents that are listening. I want you to be leaders in your home, and I want you to be soft in your home. I know for some homes, we pride ourselves in being strict and rigid and boundaried, and it does often breed success on the outward. I even have clients who are going through this of reconciling what I did bred success. And I'm realizing maybe that wasn't the best way to do it.
Success in what sense?
Right. A measurable success, whether it's in school or jobs or athletics or.
But connection with them? Probably not.
Right.
Yeah.
And so if you can pair both, of course, give your kids structure, but also allow a little bit of softness, silliness, playfulness, vulnerability, authenticity. It won't harm them as much as we might think it might.
And that goes right back to, are your boundaries too rigid that you can't be soft?
Yeah.
Why? What is that? What's the reason?
Our kids' favorite things that they talk about in memories are times when Chris and I, my husband and I, are silly or playful or play with them in the pool or put paint on our face or whatever. I get to soften my boundaries in those moments. Are they still going to brush their teeth later and still going to follow directions? Hopefully, yes. Are we still going to encourage them to excel and have boundaries around their bedtime and all the things? Yes. And incorporate softness and let them see you cry. Let them see you fall apart. Let them see you have conflict with resolution. They need all of that, not just the rigid structure as a parent.
And it oscillates, it changes.
Absolutely.
You think about boundaries with one's body.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Very probably strict in a lot of cases.
Mm-hmm.
Very rigid.
Mm-hmm.
That case, it might make sense it's rigid.
Sure.
But then when you get in a romantic relationship or something like that, where maybe rigidity doesn't open the door for vulnerability in that context, that's exploring. So like maybe it's okay to be very rigid boundary, like at work. Like
absolutely
no way you can spank my ass, right? But maybe at home, like that's okay. And so it's very contextual. It doesn't mean you have to change all the boundaries in every context. And I love the boundary exploration myself. I think about and try to reevaluate at least yearly of where are my boundaries? What's it doing for me? Why am I feeling this way? Is this a product of my boundaries with these people in the relationships or what have you?
And do I need firmer boundaries sometimes? That's the enmeshment piece. Do I need firmer boundaries? Sometimes it is about firming them up, not just softening.
Yeah.
So on the side of any coin, there's two sides.
Maybe this
is no different.
Maybe it is getting a little more rigid if you're enmeshed, but not to the extreme, right? The Goldilocks. Yes. Where is that for you? And again, that Goldilocks, that perfect place is going to be different for different people.
Absolutely.
In different contexts.
Absolutely. And so at the core of this, assess what your boundaries are, what would feel good for you. Advocate for them. If you don't know how to soften or you don't know how to hold a boundary the reverse, get support. Go to a therapist. Talk to someone that in your life maybe is good at this sort of thing. Get some feedback because the hope is you are confident in self, you're secure in self while still respecting and honoring those around you.
Yeah,
in our culture. I want to be really clear about that. In our culture.
Yeah, and that changes, like military, it's its own culture.
Absolutely.
And I would say rigidity serves a function in the sense of, well, one, compliance, but two, like a lot of the stuff you're working on is important to life-saving and mission success. What I see is people carry that rigidity over in other contexts of their lives. You don't have to. right? You don't have to be that rigid with your kids because you have to be that way at work.
Mm-hmm.
You see this with like firefighters and police officers.
Mm-hmm.
There's a culture there. It doesn't necessarily have to be that case at home.
100%. Nor do you have to, what would be boomerang, right? You don't have to, because you're rigid at work, be totally enmeshed at home and diffuse in your boundaries. You can find that healthy sway. Well, this has been Relationships Inside Out, where today we explored a second part of boundaries, where we talked about rigidity in our boundaries, or that firm steel-based boundary that doesn't have much pliability for others or consideration for others. As always, if you have any questions or topic suggestions, please feel free to email us at relationshipsinsideout@gmail.com. Thanks so much.
Thanks.